What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the Bantu Sun. Thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to touch base on one of the projects that I'm currently working on. We have a new series called the War Brief, where I'm going to be showcasing various wars and the various components that go into that. And I'm looking to make it into a very educational but learner friendly content to get a better understanding of some of the great wars of history and break it down to digestible concepts to build up to larger understanding from lessons learned and great takeaways where you can actually gain insight from the content of the product. So our first product that we're going to be rolling out is going to be based on the U.S. Civil War. And I picked this war as our first war for numerous reasons, but of course the major reason is because it was so critical in the foundations of America. Because after the Americans finally rebelled against the British through the Revolutionary War, then of course in the War of 1812, then America really had to focus in on itself and ask itself what kind of country it was. And looking and diving into the content, I want to share some of the great insight I got because I now even view the war differently. So, the whole premise of the war is primarily on the understanding of states' rights. Of course, you have the North and then you have the South. So, these two parts of the country at this time could be no different. Outside of their Anglo foundings, and even that is debatable. So this war primarily is going to be east of the Mississippi River War, right? So the seeds of it is born out of the 13 colonies. And I always say 13 colonies, this is how I remember my 13 colonies. Three babies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, because they're smaller states. Three news, New Jersey, New York, New Hampshire. I have my four middle states, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, three middle states, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania. And then my four southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. As you can see, 9 out of 13 of those colonies actually side with the North. You have a couple border states in there, your Delaware, your Maryland, but this is the early foundings of America. All these states these are East Coast states because America was built, modern day America was built from the East Coast to the West Coast. These states are east of the Appalachian. And what happened in America is each one of these places, and when I get into the American Revolutionary War, we're really going to dive into these 13 colonies. But to sum it up for these purposes is each one of these colonies were a laboratory, a brainchild, whether for religious freedom, such as the states of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts Bay, or you talk about the Quakers coming here and lifestyle choices, looking for egalitarian lifestyle. Talk about a labor, a yeoman's paradise in a place like Georgia. You talk about traditional Cavalier aristocrats, where you talk about Maryland and Virginia. Financial groundings, of course, can't forget New Amsterdam, which is later become the New York City. So all of these parts of the country, various people settled in America to pursue these interests. Of course, they all have to be financially viable, but this is kind of the foundings of America. These disparate groups, most from Europe, trying to find a home in North America. Now, I always say this: you have the problem child, and I hate to call it a problem child, but you have the great and interesting South Carolina. So what you gotta understand is the slavery in the northern part of the South, Virginia, is different than the slavery that was in South Carolina. And we touched on this. And we have our U.S. puzzle, and I make sure I link to that where we have our jigsaw puzzle where we provide a guide booklet. We constantly talk about that as well. But the reason why the South Carolinians were so different is because American slavery, a lot of the harsh slavery, really is built around the tropics, the Caribbean and Brazil. Remember, I always say only 5% of African slaves came to the United States. A large population of African Americans in the United States now come from an American base. This is African slaves that proliferated inside the United States, not because they were taking a large number of African slaves, relatively speaking, from Africa. 95% of African slaves landed in the Caribbean and Brazil. So in South Carolina, what you had was overflow from the British Bahamas at the time, Barbados. So the British had Barbadian planters. This is where the British were growing their sugar. And of course, due to lineage rights and whatnot, as people wanted to grow, they had multiple sons. These second and third generation sons, they wanted more land, as well as the island was small, and they looked to expand it. And what happened is these sugar plantations were a lot more intense. They were very intense places. They required hundreds and hundreds of slaves, as opposed to American cotton plantations would require dozens. And so these Caribbean planters, they had a very, very, their mindset was on a industrial scale when it came to slavery. It was a totally different degree. They saw the African slave as completely different. The way they operated was completely different. It was slavery on steroids in the Caribbean, under some of the harshest conditions on these sugar plantations. Now, of course, America doesn't live, the United States doesn't live in the tropics. So as these founders, as they look to expand and they run out of space in Barbados, they go to Jamaica, and some, of course, come to, and they go to South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is not in the tropics. So as they experiment, and they found some success with rice in South Carolina. And of course, they brought over some West African slaves that had experience in doing this. But the reason why this is so different is because when you have slavery in a place like Virginia, slavery was, it was kind of like an indentured servitude. You wasn't condemned to slavery. There were slaves that brought their freedom, and it became African slaves that end up having African slaves after they got their freedom. You have this Black intellectual class in this area of the country, in places like Maryland and Delaware and Virginia. You have successful Black business people. Whereas South Carolina, no. If you were a slave, you were a slave, and you were seen at that on an industrial scale. So when the cotton gin came out in the late 1700s, it really changed the game, because up until then, America really didn't rely that much on slavery. It had never been that economically viable to drive extreme results. People got wealthy off of it in South Carolina, of course, to the degree that even though Georgia was meant to be a workman paradise, a lot of South Carolina economically just took it over. And it became a plantation state, just like South Carolina, because it was just so, the industry was so fruitful. And once the cotton gin came, then slavery just went bonkers. They couldn't freaking fill the plantations enough, because they had reached out. They got to that fertile Mississippi Delta, and the southern slave owners lost their mind. Now, let's not forget, though, the roots of this slavery, the roots of the mindset and the people that was moving out to Mississippi and building these plantations, a lot of these people come from that South Carolina class, that South Carolina mindset. So we went to the museum, and when I went to the museum, there's an African Museum, Slave History Museum in South Carolina, and they have an amazing stat. It was something like, which I verified, but half of America's 8 out of the 15 largest slave owners in America, and this is slave owners that had more than 500 slaves, which is astronomical for American numbers. In the Caribbean, it's another day, it's a Tuesday, but those are astronomical numbers for an American slave owner. But half of them, 8 out of 15, were South Carolinians, right? And what happened was the cotton gin came out late 1700s. So Mississippi was just getting started, because America was almost there at the Civil War in the 1860s. So they were just really getting started. But what happened was, this had created a very strong, unique culture in the South. A lot of these people are British, English, Scots-Irish, not Irish, Scotch-Irish, primarily Scotch-Irish. It was some Irish, but I could say Scots-Irish especially. and Scots as well. And I say that because the Irish that came, a lot of them come from Northern Ireland. That's a whole different conversation, but it's a really interesting conversation. But basically, these people, the Europeans that lived in these southern states, come from the British Isles. Now, contrast this to the North, what is going on at this time. The North didn't pitch their wagon to agriculture because they had such great industrialization. Remember, the bulk of America, like Virginia, for most of the history at this time, was America's most populous state. But Virginia's right there on the border. But you had a lot of populous states up north, and it's a lot of industry. You got business, you got finance, you got industry, you got steel process. America's industrializing, and you also get a very diverse class. See, in the South where you have slavery, it's the master, the lowly overseer, or like a poor working class whites, and then you have your slave class. This is pretty much the room in the South. It was this Game of Thrones hierarchical, we would say a caste system, you could almost say, but it was a fiefdom. It was not economically. You didn't have a lot of economic movement. When in the North, you really have this desire and need for labor to fill these factories. So if you're a migrant coming to America, you're not going to go to the South because what job are you going to get? You can't compete on wages against slaves. You're going to go to the North. And you see this. You see a lot of diversity in the North. You see Germans, Scandinavians, Danes, Dutch, etc. All these different classes come in. And although a lot of these people are European, it's a very diverse batch of Europeans. Where in the South, you just have white and black. And the numbers are different as well. Like some of these, I actually was going through the statistics, which is absolutely phenomenal, to see some of these things where they break down, where you can see the whites, the blacks, the free blacks, and like color races and Native Americans, etc. And in the South, you got states 30, 40, over 50% African, like in a case like a South Carolina. And in the North, you have states at this time, 99% white, European background. So you really have this dichotomy of thought. Now, as I say, the roots of the Civil War conflict lies in this understanding of states' rights. Because that was the South is saying. Like, the South is like, we want to do our own thing. And it really comes to the head. Now, it manifests itself through the most repugnant issue of the day, the most polarizing issue of the day, which is the existence of slavery. And because as these states, as America is furiously and inexorably, through manifest destiny, expanding westward, they have to decide what to do with the states. And of course, the South going to say make them slave states because they don't want the North out having more power within Congress, and vice versa, right? It's a legislation thing. This is where you get things like 3/5 compromise. 3/5 compromise, a lot of people get upset about this, but the 3/5 compromise was actually meant to punish the South. I don't want to say punish, but to check the South, because they full of all these slaves. And the South is like, hey, we got all these people in our states. Give us more votes, give us more power. The North is like, no, like those people they're not even allowed to be free. You can't count them as free people to boost your power within Congress. So they basically came across that 3/5 compromise to mitigate the South power, to not include the African slaves as whole beings, which would give them a stronger pull within Congress. So you start to come across these little nuances in history, and all these things come to a head in Greer, South Carolina. South Carolina, attack on Fort Sumter. Lincoln get elected in South Carolina, like, we're not playing this game no more. We don't trust Lincoln. We don't trust you Republicans. They attack Fort Sumter. That kicks off the Civil War. They also the first state to succeed. And this is why it's so important to understand history, because now you understand why these things happen in South Carolina. They were a different breed. They came from a different place than a lot of these other 13 original colonies. And it really, the demographic makeup, the cultural makeup, these were two different worlds that were going against each other. And while the North had embraced modernization, industrialization, you can almost say, in the South had really embraced this. It became so it's like, I want to say it's like a modern apartheid state in South Africa. We have like this disparate quality of life. Like you have people in Mississippi that would be considered billionaires today. It became so imbalanced, and it really became repugnant. One, because these people lost their humanity through the fantasy of it all. You know, you have these people that think they're overlords, you got slaves, and you develop these complexes of which that you're beyond human. And therefore, if you're beyond human, people must be under you. And it really creates this hierarchical mentality that the gentry culture became absurd. You know, this is the type of place, you know, you go around smacking people with gloves and gentlemen's and duels and these balls, just the grandeur. It was almost a fantastical place in the South because of the disparity of living between the haves and the have nots. And it got to the point, I think, it became like a drug because the South was so backwards in this war. And there's a famous great quote out there where General Tecumseh Sherman lays it out. The South was so backward on every scale because they were so fixated with maintaining this life. They were so enamored with this concept of slavery and the benefit it gave them. They didn't realize they had basically enslaved their way through backwardness. They had regress because the world was moving forward and they were still at an agricultural base. The North was about tariffs. They was like, we want to put up high taxes so industry in other places don't compete with us. The South was like, no, get rid of those tariffs because they had a product which was no value add. They had a raw material. They just take it, pluck it, put it on a ship and send it out to the world. So any tariff on that is a punitive to them because they don't have a value add to rise above the tax of a tariff. Because all they got to do, all the customer do, which is what they did, which is why the South could really not garner foreign support, was they'll just go to another country that just pluck it and put it on a ship. It was really no value add. It was nothing special about what the South had did. They had become a banana republic in almost this case. And they were so enamored, fixated with justifying their superiority over African slaves that they have forgot the necessity of viability on this world with their fellow human. So they thought they lived in a bubble, and they found out harshly that they did not. So when you see it, that's why as the war goes on and on, the North just becomes this beast. The North basically becomes what America is now. The production, the supply chains, the logistics, the infrastructure, all these things. A lot of the war primarily fought around Virginia. And it shows you how regressed the South had become in comparison to its northern counterparts. And General Sherman cut through the South like a hot knife through butter. So, of course, the South had their conviction. They had great generalship. But you really learned about this, I think, as I'm going through, just seeing how these different groups, how these different cultures interacted, and then the subsequent consequences of this conflict. So I just want to express some of my thoughts on going through this content. As you can see, it's just a great subject. It is so many fruitful and rich lessons that I learned from it. So please be on the lookout for this product. I'll make sure you guys all know that when it comes out. But I really think it's going to really open some eyes. I know it's going to open some eyes and it's going to bring some great value to people that seek to understand America's history and how they can learn from it. So I'd love to hear your comments on some of the things I said. If you have any insight, feel free to comment below. Like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.